Recording in progress.
Good evening. At this time, we'd like to convene the Palo Alto City Council Finance Committee meeting for Tuesday, November 19th, 2024. Would the clerk please call the roll?
Mayor Stone.
Here.
Vice Mayor Lowing.
Here.
And Chair Burt.
Here.
For the record, Mayor Stone is present as an alternate for Councilmember Vinker.
Great.
Excuse me, Mr. Chair and Clerk, I have a statement about the recusals just to put on the record. So there are two officials who would typically be here who are not with us. They are recused on this item. Committee Member Vinker and City Manager Shikata. Councilmember Vinker does patent work for Stanford University, and therefore she's recused from this item. And the city manager's wife is an employee of the Stanford hospitals, and he is recused for the same reason. Thank you.
Great. So our first item is an opportunity for members of the public to speak on any item within the purview of this committee, but it's not on the agenda. Do we have any members who wish to speak?
Yes, Chair Burt, staff received one general public comment before the meeting from Lisa Marie Madden. Unfortunately, she is not here in the room, and so can probably just disregard.
Okay. If she comes later, perhaps we'll.
Yes, and there are no public comments online.
There is a hand raised online, Clerk. I don't know if that's for public comment though.
I see Penny Elson raised hand.
Can you hear me? Can you
Yes,
hear me?
we can. Yes, we can.
Okay, great. Thank you for confirming. So I just want to make sure that the first item is the one that I see on the agenda, evaluation of fire and ambulance service. Is that correct?
Yes, it is.
Okay, great. I was glad to see an option for a fire engine at Station 4 mentioned in the executive summary of the staff report.
Okay, but Penny, that will be item 1. We're right now on general public comment.
Oh, okay. I'll wait. Sorry,
okay, thanks.
Sorry about that.
Okay.
Came in late.
Okay, so we'll now proceed to item 1, which is the evaluation of fire and ambulance service expansion options. Chief Blackshire, you're going to kick it off?
I will. Actually, Chief, if I can start just to kick this off. So just want to, as we embark on this conversation, acknowledge where this is stemming from. You know, this is a referral that the committee and the council provided our team as part of the FY 2026 budget process. And I just want to acknowledge the inherent tension that the committee, the community, and staff may feel as part of this conversation. You know, obviously, we all are going to want and have the desire to maximize safety in the community and ensure folks' safety in the best and most effective way possible. At the same time, I recognize that as an organization, as a council, and a community, we also have to manage finite resources, competing priorities of both the organization as well as the community. And so these are topics that I do expect to come up as part of this discussion. So I just want to acknowledge that we won't necessarily solve everything, but there are inherent tensions as we move through this. We are talking about a major investment in a really complex system. We've got multiple apparatus. We have many partners in this, and there are labor impacts as well. So what staff are planning on basically is you'll hear from our fire team operationally. I think the fire chief obviously is going to lead on that, responding to the council's referral. And then I would like to turn it over to our chief financial officer to just give the committee a little bit of color on where we're at financially. We don't have those reports yet. Unfortunately, we will have that on your agenda December 3rd. But obviously she can provide a little color commentary to help the committee understand the status of things. Okay. With that, Chief Blackshire.
Thank you for that introduction, Kylie. Appreciate that. Geo Blackshire, Fire Chief, Palo Alto Fire Department. Good evening, Finance Committee. Who's running the? Okay, good. So as Kylie said, this is us coming back to you as a referral. For the last budget hearing, we had made a request or to put another engine in service, and the budget was adopted for 3 FTEs to put engine 62 back in service in College Terrace. And then we also had a discussion about engine 64, which is the fire station in Mitchell Park, and another ambulance, peak hour ambulance. We had a discussion about that, and that's why we're here now, to give you more information on those items. So we're here to talk about an evaluation of fire and EMS services and expansion options. Next slide. So everything that we're going to present to you is really based on data that we, measurable data that we received through ongoing measurements from us, and also studies that have gone on over the years. We base it primarily on community needs for emergency response. In this case, it's EMS service, but also all calls for service. Calls for service is anything that when someone calls 911 and asks for fire response. So our call volume is exceeded the call volume that was where it was pre-COVID. It's also notable that in regards to ambulances, that our reliance on county ambulance has increased, significantly increased over the years. And the way we measure performance, availability, and resources, I want to start with response times. In the 90th percentile, our response time, our standard is 8 minutes or less 90% of the time. We measure in percentiles and not averages. I just want to make that clear. And for an ambulance, the county average or the county expectation standard is to get on scene in 11 minutes, 59 seconds, or just 12 minutes, 90% of the time. In fiscal year 24, county ambulances response in the 90th percentile was 29 minutes and 53 seconds compared to Palo Alto Fire Department's ambulance at 12 minutes and 2 seconds. So we're right. I mean, we really are meeting that expectation, that standard. County ambulances accounted for 8% of EMS responses into Palo Alto, and you'll see that in the chart that's on that page. Next slide, please.
Sorry, can you say 8%, but I see 327 of 9,400, which is close to 3%. Am I misunderstanding something?
Oh, I'm sorry, 8% of medical responses, EMS responses.
Thank you.
Yes, I'm sorry, not total. My apologies. Good catch. So in regards to performance, availability, and resources, there's three ways that we measure that. It's with response times, which is the time that the caller calls 911 and the time that we arrive on the scene. That's the response time. Another measurement is unit hour utilization. That is a measurement of unit availability and not performance, or not productivity. And then there's resource levels, which is how many resources we have available to respond to those calls. So the goal is we measure units by the 10% unit hour utilization. So anything above that compromises our availability to run simultaneous calls. And so there was the Santa Clara County Local Area Formation Commission, LAFCO, did a fire service review and took data from 2018 to 2022. And in that data, they showed that that Palo Alto's 90th percentile response time was 9 minutes and 41 seconds. And in 2024, the 90th percentile in our response time is 9 minutes and 12 seconds. So it is better, and I can explain that later. When it comes to unit hour utilization, as I said, the 10%, anything over 10% unit hour utilization compromises our ability to be available and running multiple calls. We had an engine at 10.7% UHU. All three of our ambulances are somewhere between 18.5 and 22.3 UHU. Medic 64, which is stationed, the only unit stationed at the Middlefield Fire Station, is at 19.1 UHU. And the 4 remaining engine companies are close to 9 or over 9% UHU. And in that study, it was determined that Palo Alto is the busiest per capita fire department in the counties, and our numbers are steadily increasing. Next slide, please. So we have the resource analysis options. As I said, we are got the direction from the Finance Committee in fiscal year 25 budget hearings to be here. We used a data-driven approach to come up with these determinations. Fire engine at Station 4 and a 12-hour peak ambulance is what the resources we're trying to add to the system. And we have a 2-year implementation timeframe for all the options that will be presented to you. The 3 options will include a contract option, which means we would contract an ambulance to supplement our current service, a private ambulance. The second option would be just to hire additional firefighters to staff Engine 64, the fire engine at Station 4, and the ambulance, the additional peak hour ambulance. And there would also be a single role civilian option. And that's when we displace the firefighters on 3 of our ambulances with civilians, paramedics and EMTs, and those firefighters would be displaced to staff the fire engine at Fire Station 4. And so that is the single role option. I'll go into more details about that. The predictive analytics that we use to model these options are the same model that we use whenever we move units around. For example, when we rebuilt Fire Station 3, we had to move a unit around. We used predictive analytics to show the efficacy of a model moving 2 engines downtown. Matter of fact, we used the same model when we had to brown out the fire engine over at Station 2 to see how which unit we had to brown out, and that's how it was chosen, through predictive analytics. So we use the same thing to determine which models would work to reduce response times, the UHU, and help us be self-reliant. And again, one of the goals is just to not rely on county ambulances so much, because the time response from county ambulance is significant, and they're dealing with some of the same problems too. And we could talk about that later, but their calls increasing availability, they're also challenged in the county as well. Do we have our EMS director? Should be available online to talk about the EMS expansion benefits. There he is.
James Duran. Sorry, I am remote today. So one of them, I think about looking at a couple of different options, the 3 different options that Chief Blackshire mentioned. They all are based on county ambulance performance. They're as not unique to Santa Clara County. There's a lag of resources available throughout the nation, if not in the Bay Area, that's even greater. Very few resources available. Other fire departments are staffing up to meet that need. Our ability to be self-reliant is becoming less and less, and we're relying more on county backup, which takes quite a bit, but it also takes away from other jurisdictions throughout the county. There is a connection of response time to patient outcomes. For the studies have shown that for every minute that goes by without CPR or defibrillation in process, it decreases the survivability, and that's what most systems are based on, by about 10%. And so if a county ambulance doesn't get there within a period of time greater than 10, 15, 20 minutes, it really affects patient care and outcome. And then we have other issues that since there is a lack of ambulances within the system, there are clinics and skilled nursing facilities that would rely upon county ambulances to transport their patients in non-emergent modes to the hospital, are actually relying on the 911 system to take those patients to the hospital just due to their lack of resources, which then for us, it's a full response. An engine and a medic unit is responding to those calls, and It just takes our ability to handle the critical calls out. Next slide. Chief, did you want me to go over that, or is that?
Yeah, I'll take it from here. Thank you. So to expand a little bit on what EMS Director Jim Duran talked about in regards to the county ambulance and fire service ambulances. So there are multiple fire departments in the county, even though, so we're the only fire department in the county that has the right to transport, which means we have ownership of our transport business in here. Our ambulances do not leave the city, so they are very exclusive to Palo Alto. However, there are fire departments in the county that have purchased ambulances, San Jose, Santa Clara, Milpitas, Gilroy, and most recently Mountain View. Now, so in short, the way they're able to respond by the agreement is this Appendix A, which means if the response is determined to exceed 18 minutes, then that fire department is able to deploy their ambulance to minimize that time. The county is in a state right now where that Appendix A is not a factor, and fire departments are now deploying their ambulances just on basic response, and they're not having to get that clearance of 18 minutes. And so they're pushing ambulances out there to help supplement and in many cases subsidize the current system in the county. And so what he was referring to is that when all our units are utilized, we count on the county system to supplement. So all our 3 ambulances are on incidents. We need another call comes in, we count on county. So again, it's extended time, but also we're drawing that from other communities. We don't know where that ambulance is coming from, depending on how busy at the time of day it is. We're drawing from their system. So again, the goal is to really be self-reliant here in Palo Alto. And that's why we're asking specifically for that, advising for that peak ambulance, because peak ambulance is when those calls really draw in. We don't need that another full 24-hour ambulance because the call volume drops at night, but it's that peak ambulance. So let's just give a little context to what he was referring to about ambulances in the county and when the situation that we have at hand. So there are the 3 options. Option A is the contract. That's the one we talked about, where a private ambulance would contract with the city to provide a peak ambulance, which would hours to be determined, but typically let's just say it's 8 a.m. to 8 p.m., that 12-hour when our call volume starts to pick up. And that would include, including Engine 64, the Fire Station 4 firefighters, that would include having 10 FTE firefighters would be added to the department. And then there's consideration and bullet points under that. Next slide. Option B. So this, Councilmember Lowen or Vice Mayor Lowen, you had asked what it would look like if we just happened to hire firefighters to staff the engine and the ambulance. And this is that model here. Again, it would be a peak hour ambulance that would be staffed on overtime. And then and 10 firefighters would be added to the department to staff Engine 64 at the Fire Station 4. Next slide. And then this is the single role civilian model that I spoke of. This would mean that we would hire civilians, both paramedics and EMTs. They would not be firefighters, but they would staff the 3 of our ambulances, and the firefighters on those ambulances would staff up Fire Engine 64 at Station 4. This would be a peak hour ambulance starting out. Then 2 of the 24-hour ambulances. 1 of our ambulances would still be staffed with firefighters in this model because they would still be part of our effective response force to respond to actual fire emergencies. So if there was a fire, that ambulance responds instead of the civilian or a rescue, because they could also be tactical assistance on those emergencies. This would include a total of 25 FTE single role division staffs, included management, and support would be added, with 3 FTE firefighters would be reduced in this case. And so we modeled this after actually the fire department that recently had gone to this model is the Berkeley Fire Department. So we've been paying close attention to their model, how they rolled out, how successful, or how, the performance of that model. So we've been watching them closely. So those are the 3 models that are options that we have spoke about that we're bringing to you. And so next steps, next slide, please. Thank you. To receive report responding to council referral, discuss and receive any feedback from the Finance Committee as appropriate. Staff will further evaluation as council provides direction. Staff will continue work associated with the development of the annual budget process and continue to research methods to offset operating costs with revenues such as, but not limited to, fees like the first responder fees and reimbursement for services, for example, Stanford contract. So that is the end of the presentation. And we are here to answer your questions.
Super. So I'd just like to add a couple of comments relative to the financial position of the city. As you may recall, in our long-range financial forecasts and the adopted budget, the city's general fund is still having a deficit, a shortfall where revenues are insufficient to pay for our expenses. On December 3rd and this Thursday, the Finance Committee will receive the packet for the upcoming study of the long-range financial forecast, whereby it's very similar to what we've seen previously. We have a deficit for the next 3 years and can balance in 2030. Fiscal 26 budget is looking more like a $12 million base deficit. As noted in the three options before you, the ongoing costs are about 3 million plus. And so when we look at ongoing costs, especially on the labor side, that will have an impact on this foreseeable deficit. So as the chief mentioned, it will be very important for us to continue to look at different models operationally, financially, whether it's reducing costs and or finding revenue offsets to fit this within available funding. What we do very well is our budget development process where, the full council gives us feedback, gives us direction, helps us focus amongst our various priorities. And so like prior years, this is a priority amongst many priorities. And so getting some feedback and focus by the full council would be very useful, especially in this upcoming budget cycle. So I wanted to bring that back to the Finance Committee from a financial perspective. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions before we go to members of the public?
I'd rather hear members from the public first.
Okay, let's do that. And
Okay. Hi, Penny. Hi, Penny, can you hear us?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
now we can.
Great, thank you. So Penny Elson, speaking as an individual, I was very glad to see an option for a fire station or for a fire engine at Station 4 mentioned in the executive summary of the staff report. The report repeatedly refers to this as adding a fire station to Station 4, or it says expanding fire service in this area. This I find very misleading. The option actually would be to restore a fire engine that was eliminated in 2020 as part of pandemic budget cuts. And I know that other fire engines have been restored since that time. Restoration of a fire engine to Fire Station 4 is badly needed in the Southeast quadrant, which is dominated by fire-sensitive Eichlers and Mackey homes. This area is about to experience a burst in housing construction, which the city has zoned for, which can add to fire danger, as we've seen in San Jose and Redwood City, where apartment complexes under construction caught fire. And there were large-scale fires, not small ones. The staff report tells us that the most effective increase to city emergency response resources is adding, or rather restoring, a fire engine at Fire Station 4 and a 12-hour peak ambulance. And I just want to say I support that. As a resident of the southernmost part of District 4, which now depends on fire engines that may be delayed by crossing multiple very busy multi-lane roads like El Camino Real, the train tracks, and Alma Expressway, or coming from Embarcadero, crossing Embarcadero, Oregon Expressway, and multiple other streets to get down to the end of town that I live in. I've been trying to get information about response times to the specific part of District 4 that I live in, that, you know, it's not Midtown, but really South Palo Alto, close to all these construction areas and the border of Mountain View, which I understand we now really can't rely on quite so much for fire service. So as I read through this report, it became increasingly clear to me that this is something we badly need, especially given everything that's going on right now in this part of Palo Alto. And I hope that council will give very careful consideration to this. And I'm not sure where I would find the money and the budget for it, but we may need to cut some other services in order to restore the fire engine to this part of the city, given everything that's going on here. And I think that completes my thoughts. Thank you for your time.
There are no other public comments.
Thank you. Ed, did you want to start?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. I have a lot of questions, so better start the timer on me. I have a very colorful document tonight with all my questions colored up. But I want to start a little bit more bigger picture. Well, actually, no, let me start from your service chart, because I have a bunch of questions on that, and then I want to get back up to just understanding the alternatives. It's just stunning data. You know, we are we're 34%. The population of Santa Clara is 34% larger, but they have only 12% more call volume, and with Mountain View, we have 70% more calls than Mountain View does, and we're the same size. Have you talked to Mountain View? Do you have any research on what's in that? Are they different kinds of calls? First of all, these are call-ins. These are not trips, right? These are calls that you're getting.
Correct. These are incidents.
Yeah.
Correct.
Right. But it's just stunning data. Same size city, and we've got 75% more calls. Are people just lonely and calling in, or what's the deal here?
No, I don't know exactly what, I mean, it could be demographics. It could be, Stanford University they draw a lot of calls in our
That was my
system.
next question,
Yeah.
actually. My next question is, what's the Stanford component of that? And are they different kinds of calls than what we get from non-Stanford students?
Sorry, Kevin McNally, Deputy Chief for the Fire Department. The incidents on Stanford campus do vary greatly. We get a lot more fire alarms from that facility. We also get a fair degree of medical aids, evening times, if you will, on the weekends.
You mean that's different than what we get from quote normal Palo Alto?
Correct.
Okay.
Student population draws a different demographic during the weekends and evenings. I will say the difference between Palo Alto and Mountain View, though, we do have a large downtown population. We get a large influx of people in that regard. They get a similar one out at the Google complex, but the call doesn't seem to be, I guess the call volume doesn't seem to be equitable between the two populations. I do meet regularly with my counterpart in Mountain View, and they are constantly looking at the same as to why they're not getting, but they have medical facilities and other purposes on Google campus that may take those away from the 911 system.
Would you say your colleague is looking at why they're not getting more calls?
Well, why we have so many that they don't.
Okay.
I know that their Fire Chief Diaz in Mountain View did state that well over 90% of their calls are medical, where ours are more in the 63% medical. So it's also maybe a call type too.
Yeah. And so one of the things that you have to decide on when you get a call is, do you go out or do you ask more questions? Do you try to triage it right there, or do you just respond and send somebody out?
So we do have a triage. So the fire dispatchers do a triage for medical services. It's emergency medical dispatch is the program that they do, and they go through a survey to find out the acuity of the call.
Right. That's what I figured.
What that drives us is not the units that respond, but how we respond, whether it's lights and sirens, everything, or does one unit go lights and sirens, or do both of them? or code 2 where there are just no lights and sirens. So that's what we're trying to determine here. With this program, as Jim Dern spoke about, our EMS director, with high compliance of EMD, the emergency medical dispatch, we would be able to determine whether it's a high acuity call or a low acuity call. And, one of the civilian ambulances could be more of a BLS unit and respond to lower acuity calls. So we can triage in that regard. But currently, as it is today, we triage calls, but it doesn't determine how many units we send. It just determines how we respond.
So if you get 8149 calls, you're sending out pretty much 8149 units?
At least. And this data is from 2018 to 2022 on the chart, just as a note. Right now, our call volume, what is our call volume predicted for this year?
9,800.
9,800 this year. So that much more. But yeah, that's at least one unit. If it's a medical call, it's at least 2. If it's like a CPR in progress, that's 2 engines and an ambulance. And if it's depending on a rescue or a fire, determine the severity of that rescue, it could be anywhere, a minimum of 5 units or more.
Okay, and the staff report said that we did a fairly recent contract with Stanford. Did we do a good one? Are you comfortable with what we're charging Stanford for all these services? And does it vary by volume per month or?
I'll let Amber, she was very heavily involved in our contract.
Hi, everyone. Amber Cameron, Senior Management Analyst for the Fire Department. The contract was renegotiated in 2018 with Stanford. It was originally put together in the 1970s and had been at a 30% rate of our entire expenditure. And that was in place until 2018 during the renegotiation. We had a 2 to 3 year renegotiation process that was very contentious and did go to mediation for a short period of time. We were able to agree on a very detailed cost modeling that takes their assigned resources and spreads out the costs of the department very equitably to them. And in that methodology, they account for about 19% of our expenditures at this point in time.
And when is the next renewal?
I believe it ends in 2 years. Let me double check that really quick.
Council member, that contract ends in 2028. However, there is a clause in there that stipulates discussions if there are service delivery changes, as well as a recalculation of the share upon execution of new labor agreements. So there are reopeners within.
So we're monitoring the calls for false alarms and medical, see how much is coming from Stanford at all times. So
yes.
Okay. That's a pretty good background. I wanted to understand you discussed this in the finance committee, and I'm sorry, I'm going to have you repeat it because I want to just remind anyone that's listening and us. This came up, not exclusively, but primarily in the area of looking at ambulances for calls, and then fire as well. But when you explained it to us originally, usually when you get a call, you're sending out both.
Correct.
So you have to decide again if you're sending out what kind of units and not making sure, but you have to be somewhat comfortable that unit is really needed. And then when you add another ambulance like this, you also end up adding a lot of firefighters. So some folks in the public are going to ask, why do you need to do all that? Why don't you just put 5 ambulances in a garage somewhere? Forget about fire departments and, staff it with, we'll figure that out later in the discussion, and we're good to go. Why do we have to be talking about fire at all in this regard? I'm not saying we don't want to talk about it. I'm just saying, could we just bracket it for purposes of a cost analysis?
So just so I understand, you're asking why wouldn't we just, as a hypothetical, just staff up a bunch of ambulances as opposed to a fire unit?
Yes, because before you've told us that you're always sending out multiple.
Correct.
Because you don't know what's you're going to see on the scene.
Correct.
And so you want an ambulance and firemen and all this kind of fire people, and all that at once. I totally get that. But that doesn't mean you couldn't have just ambulance units for someone who calls in and says, my spouse is having heart pain, chest pains. And
Right.
it's not a fire. So
Correct.
you know what you're going to send out there. So I'm trying to make a distinction between those kind of service calls and therefore the kind of stuff that would go out to the scene.
Sure. So traditionally, fire stations are they're modeled in a city for quick response to make sure they get in a certain area in a certain amount of time. So typically, they're strategically placed within the city. And so that being said, when a 911 call comes in, the way the system runs today is that the fire engine would get there first and then provide that level of service. It could either be ALS, advanced life support, or paramedic support, or BLS, basic life support, or EMT. So they get there, they do that initial assessment. They provide that treatment. Meanwhile, the ambulance is also coming in. When the ambulance comes in, they do a handover. So if it's a high acuity call, they could begin whatever the services or the treatment that's needed. If it's CPR, if it's allergy attack or stroke, et cetera. So that assessment is done. Ambulance comes in. They transfer the patient to the ambulance and the personnel on there. They do some treatment on scene until it's appropriate to transport, then they transport. Then that engine now becomes available to respond to the next call. And that's how the cycle works. So the reason why it's so successful is because the fire stations are already placed strategically to be able to respond in a minimal amount of time to that area. And the ambulances transport back and forth. So to have one in each station would be a bit much. There are some cities that have done that, and it's been a saturation of ambulances to put one in every single fire station that they've learned. But the way the system is now, because keep in mind also is that the fire engines also respond to every other type of whether it's hazmat,
Right.
rescue, fire alarms, et cetera.
Right. So, but even in that example, if you knew it was just chest pains and it was an EMT that was going out
Mhm.
as opposed to quote, just an ambulance driver, that would serve the same function. They wouldn't have to be sitting on a fire truck when they arrived.
It would, but it would, unless we had, again, an ambulance in every fire station, the times would be extended depending on where they're coming from. That's the fire engine stops the clock. So the county standard is to get the engine on scene in 8 minutes or less and the ambulance on scene 12 minutes or less. So it's determined that the ambulance is generally going to take longer than the engine. So the engine initially stops the clock. And then there's that transport piece.
It was going to take longer because of the county service.
Because
Right.
No, maybe Chief, you could identify how many engines do you have in service
Yeah.
and how many ambulances do you have in
Correct.
service?
Yeah, so we have 6 fire stations, including Stanford, 5 in Palo Alto. We have the one on Stanford. We have 5 engines in service right now. So there's a fire engine in every station except the Middlefield Fire Station 4.
Right.
We currently have 3 24-hour ambulances serving the city right now. So those 3 ambulances respond to calls. So in that fashion where they're covering all the transport, but the other 5 engines are covering the initial contact with the patient. And so depending on the response from that ambulance, that crew is responsible for maintaining the level of care until that transport unit gets there. So that's not even factoring the county ambulance. That's just our own. Thanks for that, for helping me clear that out. So we have the 3 ambulances that run 24 hours in Palo Alto with 5 engines.
Yeah. So, I'm probably the model to understand our starting point
Mhm.
to see where we sort of add on. But what I was probing with that question is, like a fully staffed station, which is whatever, we have to hire 12 firefighters to essentially get the EMT, which is in this exercise was what we're trying to focus on. I'm just wondering if we should just have separate EMTs that could be added to the 3 ambulances so that if you knew it was, in my same example, just chest pains, not a fire, you could just go straight to the EMT. The fire truck would never have to leave the station. Just the ambulance and then go back.
So this is which option? C? Oh, so the civilian.
I don't know if it's civilian, because I'm not making that distinction yet. I'm saying maybe EMT firefighters are a different classification, or maybe they're the same classification in terms of pay and rank and so on, but you only need 3 of them instead of 12 out of them. I'm trying to look at a way to put it in sort of the slang. Is there a better way than throwing bodies at this problem? Bodies and trucks, by kind of looking at the way that you just put an ambulance in some situations, not an ambulance and one or two trucks. That's all I'm trying to get to with this.
Yeah, you may.
I think one of the points to make is at those stations, as Chief Blackshire mentioned, we do have 5 engine companies that are there for the other incidents such as fires, rescues and whatnot. So you're really looking at a resource with capacity to do this job. So if you were to upstaff additional ambulances to have those in service to be able to run those calls, in the instance that you do get specifically what you think you're going to get, which unfortunately is not always the truth, you're still going to have that engine company need, as was mentioned by one of the commenters, having an Eichler in the south end of town or having another emergency, a fire in that district. The water on the fire engine is generally what you're going to want. Having the ambulance company there is huge for resources. Having an engine company and an ambulance on scene for medical aids at times is a lot, and it's more than necessary. But as Chief Blackshire mentioned, you're stopping the clock, you're getting care as quick as you can, and trying to minimize the additional resources you need. If we had less engine companies and more ambulances, we would run into a problem when those more, extreme emergencies happen where we do need those resources. But in the medical aid, the engine company does do dual purpose, whereas the ambulance can't.
Okay, then another question related to that is that, and maybe this is getting into C with civilians or not, but the contract ambulance right now, we use the county as our first backup.
Correct. We
Right.
don't have, yeah, to be clear, we don't have a contract with the county.
Yeah.
They respond here via a mutual aid agreement with the county, but we don't have an agreement with the EMS agency with AMR in the county. And if we do so, that would likely jeopardize our right to exclusivity with the transport. So they just back our system up, but we don't have an agreement with them.
Right. And you said they were getting busy and the county wasn't even happy with their service.
So
that's another issue. But
Yeah.
I guess what I'm saying is that when we get to this, when we're just looking at what you call the peak ambulance,
mhm.
let's say you have the normal structure in place, but for peak ambulances, let's say it was civilian in this case, isn't that sort of just another ambulance parked somewhere? To go back to my other.
Correct. So that would be another ambulance that we would have at one of our fire stations that would be available to run medical calls. And again, in the civilian model, 3 of the ambulances would be EMT and a paramedic on that unit, and depending on how we model that. But yes, it would be just an extra ambulance in our system.
Yeah. Okay. I don't want to dominate. I have other questions, but if you want to move along, Chair. we can do
Maybe
that.
just if I can ask one clarification, Chief, if you had, maybe this is what Councilmember Lowing is getting to, but if you had more ambulances in the system, let's say you had 5 ambulances and 5 engines, is there ever a scenario in which an ambulance would be first due on scene because you have sufficient resources that you could send
Yeah, that's exactly.
an ambulance versus a fire truck?
If we
I understand we don't have sufficient resources for that right now, right? With 3 ambulances, they're primarily running the transportation of, but is that, if the model were, built out in that way with sufficient ambulance resources, would that be how the response happens? Or would you still send a fire engine first? I think that might be what you're asking.
No, that's exactly right. Because I think we can afford fire engines more so than a lot of fire staff.
You mean
ambulances.
ambulances?
Sorry. Yeah.
Right.
Ambulances.
I
Yeah.
understood what you meant.
So there's several ways to look at that. So on the surface, we could say if there was 5 or 5 engines and 5 ambulances, would they be first on scene? That would depend on the acuity of the call.
Right.
Many of our calls, they start with Alpha, Bravo, Charlie, all the way to Echo, depending the severity of the call. Those calls at Bravo and Charlie above would necessitate an engine and an ambulance response. The Alpha calls, we may be able to lower to, again, once they need transport or not, but it could be 1 unit type response. But right now, we don't have that model. We would need to have a higher level of compliance with that EMD service to determine what that is. And even in the county right now, there's no model that they just respond an ambulance to an emergency.
Right, but if we, in one of these, if we had our own staff that was just civilian ambulance drivers and they were on 12 hours in the,
Mhm.
sitting in the station, then they could do whatever they want, more or
Sure.
less.
I mean, they could respond and, would they respond first? That's very, very likely. Whether they'd be the only unit called, it depends on the survey.
I guess by extension on if there was we can define this later, but a more reliable outsourced service that did the same thing, that we contracted with them, but they sat there in our fire stations for 12 hours. We could do it that way as well. So it's just getting non-sworn officers to be only in ambulances.
Correct.
But it won't work if you always have to send a fire truck. So that's why I was asking the question.
Understood.
Okay, thank you.
Yep, thank you. I had asked a lot of good questions and took some of mine, so thank you. I'll be a little shorter. But one, I mean, I really have no interest in option A. I think that is going to reduce the quality of service that our community has gotten used to. I mean, one thing, testament to the Palo Alto Fire Department, one thing I think we all routinely hear from the residents is how wonderful our department is. And so outsourcing any of our services is not an option that I'm interested in. And I don't really see, I mean, there are some cost savings associated with it, but I just don't see it. I don't see a significant enough cost savings to justify the reduction in services that would make it really comfortable for me. So I want to better understand option B and option C. And I was also kind of alarmed and surprised, but happy I got this clarification about what response time, every minute delay, meaning basically a 10% reduction in a person's likelihood to be able to survive a critical event. That's alarming. And so it looks like with we're about 21% above our goal of the 8-minute response time. So we're kind of seeing somewhere between a 10 to 20%, I guess, reduction in people's ability to survive these critical incidences, which is concerning. And so definitely worth our greater investment to be able to drop that. I am curious, in your mind, option B or option C, do either one of those have a greater impact on the reduction of that response time, or is it a wash?
With those two models, excuse me, my voice is dry now.
Yeah, mine
With
too.
those two models, it would be the same outcome. It would be
Okay.
an additional peak ambulance and another engine in service at Station 4. So it would be responding the same way. The only difference is that the ambulance, if they were staffed with firefighters, would be an additional resource to respond to all calls as opposed to just medical, which civilians would only be able to respond to.
Right. And then just quick clarification on option A, would that outside provider be stationed in Palo Alto during
Correct.
the time? Okay, so the response time there too would be the same.
Correct.
Okay. So if we go to single role, I'm just kind of curious about the quality, because I mean, I understand option B, we get firefighters, it will be the same level, same quality of service now, just reducing that call time. But can you help us better understand just kind of single role? What is that experience of what is so they're EMTs, correct?
And paramedics.
Mm-hmm. So how is that differentiated from our current firefighters? What can they not do that we get with option B? And I guess, I mean, one of the things I'm kind of, what I'm starting to understand here is no matter what happens, even if we were to go to single role, we would always have firefighters on scene because they would be the first to respond, right? They would be there before those EMTs and paramedics would arrive anyways.
Correct. So that's the strategy behind keeping one ambulance with firefighters on there. So we can, in our CAD system, we could say certain call types will request certain units. So if it were a call type that required the firefighter, we could have them dispatch that particular ambulance as opposed to the ones with the civilians on there. So that's really the only difference is that in that regard.
Okay. And civilians in this context means EMTs and paramedics?
EMTs and paramedics that have not gone through a fire academy, and that's why there's I think we had 25 in that case that we'd have to hire. Lot more training, lot more likely maybe turnover. There'd be a tool for recruitment possibly. It would just be a more dynamic model. But other than that, I mean, the firefighters is more stable in regards to staffing, but in service, we anticipate it would be the same level of service.
And I mean, I know EMT is lower, less training than paramedic.
Yes.
So for the paramedics there, would they have the same level of kind of life-saving training as our firefighters?
That's correct. So they would have to be registered within the county, and then we adopt them, we sponsor them. So that means they would have to meet all medical protocols that are provided by the medical director in the county.
Okay. But EMT is lower.
It is lower. Yeah. So it is lower. But again, the same practices that we're obligated to perform as EMTs by the medical director would apply to them as well. So it'd be the same level in the county.
So if we were to do the single role, when an ambulance is responding, it would have both EMTs and paramedics on it?
Right now, we currently staff all our ambulances with a minimum one medic and one EMT.
Okay.
So that would be the same model.
Okay. That makes me, okay, that's helpful. Because I mean, I guess maybe if you're you can't have, it's kind of like too many chefs in the kitchen type issue. You can't have really more than, I guess I'm trying to understand the benefit for the city having multiple firefighters attending somebody rather than multiple paramedics. And it doesn't seem like there's any difference as far as the life-saving abilities that they're trained in.
What was that?
Yeah, I think a good way to answer that is that for EMS calls, the responsibilities of EMTs and paramedics would be the same. So the difference with what the firefighter staff would be able to do is respond to hazmat incidents, response to fire calls, those other type of emergency incidents. But with our medical calls, the single role civilian staff would be doing the same work that firefighter staff currently are doing.
Okay.
The other thing to note is just ultimately the training and the cost difference. Obviously, some of this is still outstanding, as we noted in the staff report, but a miscellaneous pension versus a safety pension, those are two very different benefit levels and costs associated with in terms of the long-term liability, as well as the training and the PPE costs. When we are talking about a firefighter versus an EMT or a.
And that was going to be my next question, is kind of moving towards more than the costs, what those long-term kind of then pension impacts and everything else is between option B and option C. I mean, I think if all things were equal, option B still seems the best to me, because then it's more versatile and we can, that's great. But if option C is significant cost savings compared to option B, then I don't see that much of an improvement there.
I think some of that is still TBD in terms of the discussions with CalPERS, which is the one who will be one of the arbiters of whether or not we're able to make it a civilian pension. Miscellaneous pension, I should say. The other thing I would say is if you just think about scalability, if you went to some extreme model similar to what I think Councilmember Lowing was talking about, let's say we wanted to add 6 ambulances, the cost of adding 6 ambulances in a civilian model versus 6 ambulances in a sworn model would be pretty significant when you think about the ongoing training necessary for the staffing and equipment. So I'll let the chief talk about that. When you're talking 1 or 2s here or there, probably not very large. But when you think about in 10 years, the scalability, there's a difference.
It's helpful.
Which one were you saying was higher there, Kylie?
Sworn staff in general are more
Which kind?
costly. Sworn,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so the civilian would be cheaper.
long term. On a
Yeah,
pension and a
as-
training,
As would
Yeah.
contract, right?
correct. Pension, training, contract.
And salary.
And
There's
salary.
About a 30% difference in salary.
Did you have anything to add on to?
Oh, no, I was just gonna, in regards to training, the EMTs, civilian EMT and paramedics would be focused just on the EMS training. They wouldn't have to do all the fire training that our current personnel do. We're more diversified.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
And then one final question. One thing I was confused about, why would we have to wait for year 2 to staff? Was engine 64 would be the new engine that would be staffed? Why do we have to wait for year 2 after station 4 is complete to be able to do that? Why couldn't we do that in year 1?
Depends on the model that we select. As you know, as we said, if we did the single role model, we would use the firefighters on the current ambulance and they would move over to the engine. So it would take some time to go through the bullet points where it would be, determine the appropriate model, go through labor negotiations, do the hiring, because it would be a complete new division. So we would start with the 12-hour peak ambulance because that's what we need right now. But then we would use that as just as a, not necessarily a placeholder, but just to get the program started. And then we would expand to the other 24-hour ambulances. And at that time, the firefighters can move over to the engine and then staff those other 2 with civilians. So it's just the reflex time, the time you say go to the time that we can staff it up in that model.
Gotcha. Okay. So if we were to go option B, then it's.
So it would still take some significant time. We would have to to hire 10 firefighters we would have to go through a hiring process. They would have to go through the fire academy and all the training that's related to that. So hiring 10 more, and then having the capacity to train them as well. Because I wish it was easy as like we could just hire them and put them on, but we could only train so many firefighters at one time.
Okay. But it's not attached to the construction of Station 4. That's not what's holding it up.
Yeah, time-wise, yeah, it's a time-wise thing. I don't think it's not directly tied to it.
Okay.
But it's just, trying to pace it out. It was that's how we factored that in. But technically it's not like it couldn't happen if if for some reason the fire station got hung up for 2 years or 3 years for some litigation. I'm like, oh, well, we can't just do this until it's done.
Perfect. That's my concern.
Correct.
We've seen that in Palo Alto a few times. So I wanted to make sure that
Yeah.
that's not what's holding it up.
That's just model. That's not a commitment.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. Those are my questions.
Can I just ask clarification? One of the things that originally, before asking a bunch of really good questions, you didn't seem like contract ambulance was in bounds for you because of the quality. But it seemed to me like the answer said that it's going to be the same amount of quality, even if it's a contract or if it's a civilian, because that's what we're going to insist on. And we're going to have so I'm just wondering if you still have high concerns about the contract ambulance option.
So most of my questions were related to options B and C.
Right. But all right, okay.
The only thing I think I heard on A was just that they would be located, the contracted EMT or whatever would be located here in Palo Alto.
They would be.
Yeah.
Right. So, but that's good, right?
But yeah, better than not.
But I thought you were worried about the sort of the quality of the staff in contract engines, and we obviously would not allow that. That'd be part of our standards, and they'd be sitting here in town. So we wouldn't own the bodies, but I was just sort of probing if you were still concerned about the quality issue there.
Yeah, well, they would not be Palo Alto firefighter. Well, they would not be the Palo Alto Fire Department employees, and that would give me concern. And I also think we'd be seeing probably much more. I think what we can do that would make this a quicker transition is going to be helpful. I can imagine that is a more kind of complex issue approach as far as negotiations and meeting a FER and some other issues too that would likely slow that approach down.
Well, on that point, if we wanted to do this faster than what the chief just outlined, we almost have to use contract ambulances in the short term.
Didn't see that in the kind of the time frames.
Yeah, it was a 18-month time frame was projected for the first A option, option A. And
I'm saying if you want to accelerate beyond that, we'd have to get folks that are available.
Right.
We would have to, so it is about a $1 million cost estimate for that contract with a private ambulance company like a FireMed or AMR. And we would have to go through an extensive RFP process at the city, which is part of what the timeline factor is for that.
So even for this peak thing, since this is not the core, this is covering the
Correct.
peaks.
It would also require labor negotiations to be able to contract out for that work as well as the RFP process.
Okay, thanks.
And if I may, just referring to what you were speaking of is the level of service. They would get the same medical service. Again, they would have to practice within the protocols determined by the EMS director in the county. But you're referring to the somewhat intangible ownership that our employees have on this community. And for what it's worth, in my experience, in my time here as a fire chief, there is a different level of service that even AMR paramedics know when they come in. They comment on the level of service that we provide to our community. It's very notable. It's very obvious. And I think that's what you're referring to is just that that intangible ownership that our employees have over this community when they're treating them. So I think that's, if I'm correct, I think that's what you're referring to.
Yes, thank you. You articulated it far better than I did.
Thank you.
So council members, and I'll defer to Lauren on this as well. I'm hearing this desire to see how fast we can implement these. And I would just like to remind the committee, and perhaps I'm haven't quite let go of my prior hat in budget. Just want to reiterate what Lauren said at the get-go, which is, we are looking at a 10, 11, $12 million deficit next year, continuing in FY 27 and 28. So we are looking at deficit spending already. This will make that hole larger. And so to the extent we want to even accelerate the timelines that are outlined in the staff report, we really also, I would encourage you to think about what you're going to reduce. Because even if you wanted to say you wanted to go for a tax measure or something like that to raise revenues, that's a general election. So that's already at least a few years out, and you already have the Coverly Geo bond on your docket. So just call it bad habit. I just want to level set because I hear the desire, and I don't want to discount that. It is important. And there is an inherent tension in not just how fast can the fire department operationalize something, but how fast can we actually find the funding to do so.
Okay. I have a few questions as well. First, a lot of the community issue has been over the lack of a fire truck with water at Station 4. And so that change occurred what year?
We took that right around COVID. We had July
2020.
Yeah, July 2020.
And do we know how the response times in that service area of 4 compare to the rest of the city?
Can you take that?
Sure. Generally, we've measured on the 90th percentile, and we have maintained our 90th percentile numbers in there. If you go to averages during that peak time, there was some lowering for an engine company response, but generally not grand, if that can be said. The 90th percentile was far higher just simply because if engine 5 responds or engine 3 responds, that's great. But when we start getting deeper into like engine 2 or engine 6 responding, and those two get extended.
So can, and I assume we're going to have a follow-up meeting on this because we're not solving everything tonight. Can we get that actual data? And I think the public would really, particularly the public in that area of town, would value seeing that data. Because there's an assumption that they're in greater jeopardy because there's lower service because they're further away from an engine in a station. And I think that, frankly, we've been doing a disservice in communication by not providing what are the facts. So I think that's very important, and as well as for us in our decision making. And if if it's still a difference, even though it's not a drastic difference, and we still have an issue that we have to grapple with. And the staffing level for the department in 2019, was it what we are potentially returning to under B, 10 additional firefighters? Are we 10 firefighters lower than we were in 2019?
If we went to the new system. Apologies, used to just speaking. If you go back to 2019, we had 26 personnel on during the day, and then we had an ambulance that was 12 hours, similar to what we're proposing today, making it 24 at night. We would be going to 30 during the daytime and 28 at night.
So in terms of total staffing for the department, how does that translate?
It's more. If you recall back in 2019, we used to cross staff to get our additional ambulances using the engine companies. So for engine 4, I worked on for years there. If it was a medical call, we responded on an ambulance. If it was a fire call, we responded on the engine company. So
that cross staffing option, it's not one of the things we're being presented with. Is there a reason?
It did. Oh, no, sorry. We actually went to great efforts a few years back to remove that. If you look at our response times, as Chief Blackshire had mentioned before, for our ambulance companies, we have reduced that fairly significantly. We used to have a tandem model where if we went somewhere on the engine, one person removed themselves, drove the ambulance around. If you got a call in the evening, you were swapping gear from one apparatus to the other in an effort to minimize our times and to increase availability in various districts. The unwinding of that was felt to be necessary.
Okay. And that's helpful. Yeah.
I wanted to add on to that just to give it some more context. So with that cross-staffing model, generally fire departments, it's not uncommon for the fire service to have cross-staff units, but standardly they cross-staff with units that are very low demand. For example, engine company may cross-staff with a hazmat unit, or engine company would cross-staff with a wildland unit. So it's not disrupted, and that engine is in service most of the time. In the case in Palo Alto, when we were cross-staffing, we took the call type with the highest frequency, which are medical calls, and they would take those engines out of service. So instead of having that engine waiting for another call, in one medical call could take 3 units out of service. You would have the engine, which is out of service because they jumped on the ambulance, and that ambulance is responding to another engine. And so this is also the unavailability of our units during this period when we cross-staff was the initiated the cancellation of our auto aid agreement with Mountain View when we had the boundary drops. And the fire chief in Mountain View said until we get fully staffed up, he has no interest in starting that boundary drop model back up. But he is interested, should we put that in service? So that's kind of, he was aware of how disruptive that was to availability of units. And so that it was that moment that he canceled that program.
Okay, let me break my follow-ups into a follow-up on that part, but then can you remind us, when did we implement and when did we end the cross-staffing?
We started cross-staffing in 2018. No, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Oh, I thought you were talking about the model that so we cross-staffed. Goodness, we've been cross-staffing for quite some time, but it was when we cross-staffed.
I remember in 2011-12 period, there was.
Before that.
There were some reforms. Is that?
Yeah.
I was hired in 2005 and we had cross-staffed engine 1, medic 1 at that time during the evening hours.
Okay, so what you alluded to about a deterioration in our response times from cross-staffing, did it happen all the way back then?
When we started studying the response times was later when we were looking at, during COVID, we were asked to reduce budgets and to maximize our resources we started studying pretty much every aspect of it. We contracted with a group called Levram that did predictive analytics to try and best model the personnel that we had based on the dollars we were given to best service the needs of the community. And realizing that some of our times were longer with the cross-staff apparatus, not to mention it was not popular amongst personnel. But truly to unwind that was to improve availability, as Chief said. I worked Engine 4 and Engine 2, which cross-staff ambulances, and it would not be uncommon for us to be on an EMS call and an ambulance coming from 2 districts over to try and cover us on that part.
So we ended the cross staffing when?
2022.
22. So it's a little hard. I'm trying to get, we've got a change in kind of our service model from getting away from the cross staffing. And then we had a reduction in staffing in 2020. And so it's a little hard to compare because it's not apples to apples there. Right. We had pre-COVID staffing with cross staffing, and now we're looking at no cross staffing and a restoration of all of the engines into service at every station.
Right.
So I'm trying to get a sense of overall in terms of headcount in the department of sworn officers. What we're looking at with these 10 additional firefighters compared to where we were in 2019. But that included, but I'll accept that with an understanding that that included cross staffing. So do we know where we would be with 10 additional officers compared to 2019 in just terms of number of sworn officers?
So actually, Pat, I think how the staff is talking about daily staffing is actually helpful as opposed to total, because sometimes we've got inspectors and we're not talking about those.
So I think both things are valuable. I'd like to know the total department headcount of sworn officers, and then we can then
the staffing
deeper
models.
and a better understanding of which of them are on serving trucks versus and ambulances versus other purposes.
I can speak to the daily staffing side. I think Amber will look up at the total. Can you pull that off of our org chart?
And Chief McNally, if you could help us remind us, what does daily staff mean?
Very well.
Thank you.
Daily staff, so we have A shift, B shift, C shift. Our platoons work a 48-hour shift, and technically they are off for 96 when B and C would take over for A shift. So what you're talking about daily staffing is those that are working on engine companies and ambulances and your daily battalion chief. So those that are effectively part of the 911 response system on a day-to-day basis, 24 hours, 365. So going back to 2019, that would be the 26 in the daytime, 24 at night. And with the new model, it would be 30 during the daytime and 28 at night.
And when we come back, it'd be nice to have these different comparisons so that we're really, both ourselves and the community are understanding. Okay.
Yeah. Did you get this sheet by chance?
No.
Okay. Never mind. We can provide that.
Okay.
And
because what we're really looking at is we got to struggle with. Sorry, I was saying we have to figure out, we'd be looking at restoring staffing to something we haven't had for 20 years. And if we go down that path, how are we going to be able to afford it? One of the other things I'd really like to see on when you come back is any other ways that we could get an engine in Station 4 at a lower cost than these 3 options. And maybe there aren't, but that's really, I think, what we're struggling with. And then When comparing, you were talking about, Chief, about the Mountain View and that 90% of their calls are medical. Versus what, 60% of ours you said, or something like that?
63.
63. So the balance that are non-medical, have you been able to break those down and have any kind of even a high level sense of what's that about? Why in a different way to do the math is that we would be 3.5 times the proportion of non-medical calls as Mountain View. 10% versus 37%. So the number, it's not on a proportion. Now I say that because they have fewer calls. So it's not 3.5 times the number, but something is really at a minimum interesting there. And I think we need to understand it. What's that about?
Okay.
Yeah, thank you. We produce an annual report each year, and that shows the breakdown of our call volume. What we present is the call type determination after it's completed. So, when you originally get the call, you might not know, is it, a hazmat call? Is it, necessarily like a fire or something like that? Or if it's a false alarm, it turns out instead. So 62% of our calls are EMS, and 15 are good intent. People thought they were having a medical event and then they're okay, or there was smoke and it wasn't a fire. 13% are false alarm and false calls. So just your alarm going off because somebody was microwaving popcorn or steam from the shower type of a thing. 8% are service calls. So stuck in an elevator is a great example of a service call. 1% are actual fires and 1% are hazmat incidents.
Why does Mountain View only have 10?
And it's much higher than that. According to Chief Diaz, it's closer to like 97% of their calls are medical. I haven't looked into it. I'm taking his word for it.
Let's
but it's
that in a follow-up. It remains a perplexing question.
We need his testimony.
yeah. I trust him.
Might be
It's
too.
Yeah.
so disparate that it begs an understanding.
And it might also be that they're, measuring it from what it was coded when it came in
Right.
versus what it was after the fact.
That's one of the things I was wondering is you mentioned that, it gets clarified on follow-ups and it could be a reporting difference.
Yeah.
Okay. And then we had lost the mutual aid agreement with Mountain View when we went to the what do we call it? Cross staffing, but we don't do that anymore.
Correct. We have an auto-aid agreement with them on confirmed structure fires and freeway responses.
I see.
So those are the two calls where they automatically respond with us and vice versa. If they have a confirmed structure fire, we automatically go with them. However, any other call type outside of those two calls is requested through a mutual aid process. So we actually have to go through the county and do an actual request for assistance as they would if we requested sources from Santa Clara or San Jose or wherever we would need that resource. It's the same process, but it's no longer automatic.
So how important would the automatic be? What's the difference in terms of quality of service that we provide?
So this started because we are both on the same CAD system. So we were dispatched by closest unit to the incident. So the CAD system could determine which unit, but the CAD system only by designation didn't know whether it was Palo Alto or Mountain View. But as far as the call is concerned, whoever's closest to the call would go. So for example, if engine 64 was not available at the time and the closest was engine 63, which is on Rinconada part, there might be a Mountain View unit in Mountain View that's closer to the south end of Palo Alto that could respond sooner. So it's really, it has us operating as one large fire department as opposed to two separate fire departments, how we operate now. So that's it's not an unfamiliar model in many cases. Matter of fact, San Mateo County operates the same way. They're just one large fire department, although they're made up of several fire departments. But when it comes to resources, whoever's closest to that unit, that's who gets called out there.
But have we not returned to that because Station 4 is closest to Mountain View?
Correct.
And that's their problem.
Correct.
So if we had Station 4, say we didn't have a truck at every station, but Station 4 was one of the stations we did have a truck once we rebuilt it. Then they'd be willing to do that. But I don't know what the other ramifications would be. That's one of the things we haven't talked about is out of the stations that don't have a truck, why was it that 4 was selected?
It wasn't so much, what's driving this is not the availability of a fire engine at that station. It's the availability of all our units, because the fewer units we have to respond to the increasing amount of calls will make us less available than we would be with that extra engine.
Well, I was assuming that it was at least in part related to the geographic location of them nearest our border. If we don't have a truck at 4, are they too often going to be supplying the truck because they're closer to us than we are to them?
Possibly. I haven't had in that detail, but my understanding is that
It's more.
it's more of a system run model than a specific location run. Again, looking at the increase of our call volume and the utilization of our units would still make less units available to respond into Mountain View should they need the assistance.
Okay. And then I did want to, the last set of questions have to do with the Stanford agreement. And I appreciate that that was a gory negotiation for a few years. And everyone, all parties are hesitant to reopen that, but I did want to understand some things. Do we know what portion of the EMS calls they are?
Sure, I can probably dig it out, but I haven't.
Yeah,
We can get it.
Add it to the follow-ups, okay. And my understanding is that part of that negotiation was that they were unwilling to pay, and somehow maybe explain to me on the medical transport that they didn't want to pay anything extra.
I can
Yeah.
update you
Thank
on
you.
that, yes. The original contract from the 70s did include them paying for ambulance transport services, and in the 2018 contract, it explicitly says that it is only for fire service and does not cover ambulance transport services, and we do carve out some of the ambulance costs from the very extensive cost calculation in order to accommodate that. So yes.
And what was their reasoning why they get ambulance service from us, right?
Mhm. I believe that it has to do with its revenue generating was a big part of it. I can, I don't know. If I
So,
could
yeah, I mean, we do get a lot of cost recovery.
Yeah.
And so it's a question of, I guess, from their standpoint of, do they need to pay for something, a portion that's cost recovery, but we don't get full cost recovery, do we, or?
No.
No.
And do we, what portion of cost recovery do we get for ambulance?
Yeah. For transport, it depends on what insurance the patient has.
I mean, on average,
Oh.
what are they, everything.
Oh, so
Mhm.
that would be our
Yeah.
I have
it's-
that.
Yeah. It also kind of depends on how you
I got
look at the costs. If you're looking at sort of fully loaded costs where you're including everyone here at this
Yeah.
table as a portion, it is, it's lower. So.
And I had heard that part of their argument was that they're already paying property tax, and somehow that is a rationale. I didn't
So-
quite follow that.
I think, no, so my understanding back when this negotiation was happening was that, there's two options for medical transport services. Either the county provides the medical transport services as part of the county's role responsibilities as the county government, or the city would provide those because we have our transport rights. So I'll need Fire to help me on what those rights are. not just the numbers, just in general. And so my understanding at the time of the negotiations was if the city was not providing transport services, that the county would be responsible for providing those transport services to Stanford. And Stanford would not be charged for that because that was part of their contributions to the county coffers.
But
through-
that's a lower quality
Correct.
service.
Correct. It is a much lower quality of service based on the information that
So I wonder whether a
Chief
reasonable
Blackshire.
reconsideration would be for the difference in quality and not the full amount.
But how do you even triage that? Because somebody's just going to call 911 and expect an ambulance.
No, they'd still get it. It's a question of what we,
Do we refer it to the county then?
no. We provide the service.
Oh, I see.
It's just they're not paying an
Okay,
additional
got it.
amount to us for that.
Okay.
Okay. Well, we've maybe beat this as much as we can tonight. It's a tough question, but I think we've given you a number of follow-up questions and we can figure out when to.
I have a few more.
Yep, okay, go right ahead.
I just want to drill down a little bit on what LAFCO really is, because it sounds like they're the standard setting commission, or what is that actually?
They're the regional agency that looks at all interjurisdictional matters, right?
Yeah, primarily that is their role, to look at all the jurisdictions, and they had hired through the what was it? Oh goodness,
And
let me get the
they're
name. I got the
They're
name.
basically a state agency
Correct.
that it's our region of the state.
Is
It
their
was.
function primarily to aggregate data and feed it back to the members? Is it that kind of model?
Yeah. Yeah, AP Triton was the vendor. They contracted with AP Triton, who does fire service reviews. And it was through I'm trying to think, City Manager at Chicago was part of the Technical Advisory Committee for Fire Service Review. So he was part of the committee that was responsible for the oversight on this study.
Right, but is their function in life to aggregate data and feed it back to the agency so you know what's going on and how you compare? Is that what they do, or is that just?
Yeah,
One of their functions.
that's one of their functions. Yeah, it's commonly they do a fire service review in different counties.
Yeah. Okay.
They, for instance, if cities annex county land, that's a LAFCO decision, various other things. So I don't know what portion of their scope is this, but it's a portion.
But it seems like
It's-
we're taking this word as divine. I mean, we like these standards and everybody goes by
Yeah,
them. So
so LAFCO is a state mandated agency that's independent and they oversee boundaries of cities and, special jurisdictional issues.
okay, good.
And
That's-
they funded a third party review of all fire service agencies in Santa Clara County. And so they pulled data and information from each one of the fire service agencies and put it together in a report. So it's the most comprehensive analysis of the state of fire service that's been done in recent history.
Right. And so it's based on data. So based on their findings, their recommendations, their assessment, they're not mandated. You pretty much, like, some of the data that they would give us wouldn't really mean so much to us, depending on as it determined. Let's say if they look at facilities and say, okay, your facility is this old, you need to replace it. Well, we're not just going to go and say we need to replace it. We say, okay, well, there's a replacement schedule for all city facilities, et cetera. So what we did was we took that report and focused on what we felt were the highest priority data points that they provided,
Sure.
and used that to our advantage. So again,
Yeah.
it's just data that they pulled. We met with them, we confirmed it. We had to adjust some of their findings because it was over a period of time. They didn't have really quite understand how we staff. For example, when they showed firefighters comparative to other fire departments, it didn't factor in that our firefighters' daily staffing are on ambulances, where every other fire department in the county, all their firefighters are on fire engines. So it looks like we have it's like they have additional firefighters, but they're not on fire engines. So we had to do some adjustments
That's
to their
good.
data.
That's
So
good that you did that and sat down and bring them up to speed.
yeah, it just gives it more credibility if
Yeah.
we just don't take it, again, just take all their information as gospel. We went through it with a fine tooth comb as well.
Okay, good. And when you say the adopted, things like the adopted standard is 90% percentile, 8 minutes, how do we get to that as an adopted standard?
So that was
that medically driven or?
no, so depends on the agency, depends on historical appropriate. So it's all tied to and I'll just be really frank, that standard, 8 minutes or less, 90% of the time, is really tied to the chain of survival as it relates to medical calls. And so what we say is that, okay, the best chance of survival for a patient is 8 minutes or less, 90% of the time. If it's a fire, same case, assuming that there's a patient in there and we have to rescue someone, the best chance of survival is to respond within 8 minutes or less, 90% of the time. It's adjusted based on the city and the demographics of the city. For example, our response time to the foothill standard is 20 minutes or less 90% of the time, because it's going to take much longer to get there. So that's a standard that we've always put in our annual reports. It's always been accepted. When we put it in, it's been accepted as our standard. It was a part of our credential when we were a credential fire department. It was
That's good.
also
Can I ask a
reasonable.
clarification on that?
sure.
So when we've got our 9 minutes and 41 seconds, is that an aggregate of our foothills and our flats, or is it just the flats?
That's all, unless that's
Aggregate.
all of them, as far as I'm concerned.
So that would include. that.
Okay, so
That's
then,
included.
It's all urgent calls.
yeah,
Yeah,
but when we're comparing ourselves to Mountain View and Santa Clara, if we accept the 20-minute in the foothills, because we have foothills that go all the way up to Skyline and the other cities don't, if we excluded foothills, I'd be interested in knowing what our
can do
standard response time is.
we could do that.
And even though it's a fairly low percentage of the city, it's skewing those numbers.
Yeah, I expected this to be medically driven, and I'm glad to hear that it is. And when we're trying to be gruesomely realistic, we can't make it, 3 minutes, which would save a couple more people every 10 years. We can't staff that way. So we have to make some of these really, really, really hard decisions. So I'm glad we're confronting that. Not quite as difficult. On the UHU, where you come up with this, effectively you could only have service people on calls 10% of the time. Right?
Correct.
Which, a layman like myself reads this and goes, whoa, that's pretty cushy.
Right.
A lot of that time they're sleeping anyway. I mean,
Goodness.
we must be given way too much paperwork, right? Because the rest of the time they're doing this. And I know that's not true,
Right.
but it's the same kind of question as how did we all end up at 10% as opposed to 12 or 15 or 20? Because there's a lot of time that's not on service calls, and we're being asked to add effectively a lot more firefighters.
Understood. And I did, when we sat down with the project manager for this LAFCO study, I had asked that question. I said,
Good.
because I knew that question would come up.
Good.
And I said, well, why is it 10%? And he said, the industry standard for AP Triton, which is one of the leaders in fire service reviews, if your standard is 8 minutes or less 90% of the time, then the 10 is that differential. For example, if we were 8 minutes or less 20% of the time, then it'd be a 20-minute UHU. So he said, because our standard is 9 minutes or less, 8 minutes or less 90% of the time, the 10 is that factor that's looked at for UHU. And if you look at Mountain View and Santa Clara that have similar response time standards and their call volume and their units that they have available, that time cuts into, it shrinks because they have more units available to respond. With factoring the call volume and availability of units, their UHU is much lower.
But was that person's response that if you wanted it 20%, then you just extend your call times?
Right.
Sorry, your service level times?
But it's also based on outcomes. So as you can see, so we're calling county ambulance 300 and almost one a day on average, a little bit less, but almost one a day. Because and if you look at the utilization of our ambulances, that means that 320 some odd times a year, our ambulances are on calls. and all three of them are on call and not available to respond.
Right.
So again, if they had a lower unit hour utilization, then they would be more readily available to respond to those simultaneous calls.
Mhm.
So again, I agree, it's not like this scientific distinction that's accurate, but it is the industry standard to try and come up with a determination of availability of units.
Yeah, for example, you say on the next page, Medic 64 operates with a 19.1 UHU and is the only resource. Have you found that to be like a compelling problem, or it's just,
They're very busy.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're very busy.
but we're not necessarily losing patients?
No, I really wouldn't tie it to, what really drives this thing that we're doing is patient outcomes. And we
Good.
know that, and when we're talking about the chain of survival, we know that the faster you can get to the patient to get them the appropriate treatment on scene and then transport them to a higher level of treatment, you get the best outcomes. So everything, that's what's driving this whole thing is how soon can we get a unit there to provide that level of treatment?
In the next phase of this, can you actually give a wild guess at the revenue streams? Because he also said that those were not actually dependent on these costs that are in this document. So I'm glad you've identified some and what they are. We don't need them tonight, but
Chief, I might ask a question I don't know the answer to, so this is a little dangerous, but if we were to look at a system with civilian medic, or the single role like we're talking about, would we still expect to see the same standard for unit utilization of those medics because the training requirements are different and the system would be, different? I kind of understand right now because all calls are dependent on engines and ambulances, but if we were to move to a more diversified model, how does that impact the UHU?
So adding that additional peak hour ambulance would lower the UHU of all, because now you have 4 units responding to the same amount of calls as opposed to 3. So it's almost like, when you have a power play in hockey and you take someone off the court, you're just trying to do,
Right.
yeah.
But what would
ice.
I guess what I'm asking is, I understand the actual utilization would go down with the additional
Right.
player on the field. However, what would the industry standard be for a medic that was, a single role civilian dedicated versus, an engine right now, which would currently has the 10%?
Then we say the industry standard in what regard?
The current staff report identifies that the
Uh-huh.
industry standard for UHU is 10%
Right,
per apparatus.
correct.
So I'm trying to think,
Oh,
if you were to have a different staffing model with civilian, would that be an additional adjustment to what I think the council members were talking about in terms of civilian versus sworn? Like you had this dedicated civilian
right.
medic or 2, what would the industry standard for UHU be on an apparatus like that?
Yeah, you may.
It's generally higher. As you said, there's less training needs and often more opportunities to get them on calls. I think to Chief Blackshire's point, the LAFCO study uses 10% as a model. So if you expect us to be at that 90th percentile and we're busier than 10%, it's automatic that the closest resource is going to be unavailable at that 11%, that 12%, that 13%. If you look at NFPA, they have a 20% standard, which basically says if you're busy on incidents greater than 20% of your day, there's not ample time for training, reports, rest, and other such duties that are necessary. So as you increase the number of ambulances that you have available, you're obviously going to shrink the workload, but when it's a single role, some of those training needs are going to decrease. Also, the rest periods with only a daytime car is going to decrease the rest periods. So the capacity in the system will increase, I should say, in a larger proportion than a standard. But also look at, we're trying to match what we're doing already today and kind of future proof it with a roughly 5% increase in those calls annually. It's trying to keep up with that.
So my final comment in terms of direction is I clearly think we need to be focused on these increasing medical calls. still like to know why they're so high, as you would too. So it's dig in there. And what medical calls need is an EMT. So what medical calls need is an EMT. They don't need a fire truck. So I'm not trying to be blunt about that. I'm saying that the focus should be to how can we, in some reasonable time frame, with all the stuff that we have to do, increase your capacity for pure medical calls, because that's the need. And I understand the model, and I understand the huge positives of the loaded engines with fire staff, but that's sort of the downside. Anytime you start talking about putting on fixed costs, sworn officers, all that training, all that benefits and so on, it just detracts from what we can get done. I mean, that's just sort of the grim realities that we're getting painted here.
Let me say that we have actually two things that we're concerned with. One is that increase in medical calls and the most cost-efficient way to address it. The other is a lack of water at Fire Station 4.
Yeah, no, I wasn't done. I was going to say, we've got a lot of stuff here and it's all important. It's medical and fire.
Yeah, but when you had said this is the thing, and I just wanted, those things are in tension with each other. If we're on looking at budgets.
Correct.
Yeah, I mean, we only need one more bad fire in the wrong area. The chief and I have talked about this over the years, and it's a disaster. So we can't just say, well, we're probably not going to have a fire. We're not going to cover it. But in terms of what we already know we have that's falling off the table is all these medical things. And I'm hoping, I'm thinking, I'm even looking at the numbers and thinking that there might be an easier solution for that cost wise, rather than this other one, but we still have to address it. The only other thing I want to say is that I thought this was a terrific report. And I think all you staffers have come here very prepared. All three of you from the fire department are ready to go, answer our questions, and that makes the whole thing really productive. So it was really terrific.
It was, but it's a tough nut to crack.
Yeah,
it is.
Okay, is that, did you have something else?
I did want to let you know that we are really actively working on finding revenue sources to help cover the cost. And you'll see that as part of the municipal fee study that's going to be in front of you. We're looking at increasing the base fee for ambulance transport.
Yeah, saw that.
It would augment our budget for that, as well as looking at a first responder fee as well. And Matrix Consulting does have a lot of experience with those types of fees. And so we're getting a lot of benefit from them. Oh, yes. And with the with expanding ambulance service, we can also if we have more ambulances in the system, when they are not on emergent calls, we can contract for interfacility transports while they're not busy. So when one patient needs to be moved to a different hospital for a different level of care or a different facility, insurance pays for that, and it's a non-emergent transport. We currently do not do that, but it is a way to generate other revenue where we could schedule those during known sort of downtimes.
Okay.
So I just want to add, we'll continue to look creatively in all those different ways. And I think the hard reality is the majority of these costs still are borne and bared by the general fund. So we will look at these revenue offsets, but as noted tonight, we still have to reconcile with the net cost of these additional programs.
Good. All right. And at a minimum, when we come back, we'll probably have the mid-year budget update and see if there are any trends. All right. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
We have one other item, sorry, which is just an information item, the status on council referrals requested and approved during the council retreat and the annual budget process.
No presentation, just wanted to give the committee an update on these referrals and see if you had any questions.
I have two quick ones, Pat.
Okay.
Over on the EPA golf course fees, Obviously, you can manage it however you want, but that's a pretty small number now that you've done the research. So I'm not sure this has to go to commissions. Just a input item.
Good
Thank
point. So what would be the process to actually implement that nominal one? Mid-year budget update?
Yeah. Possibly. It looks like staff does want to look with the Parks and Rec Commission, just to make sure we're, doing those aspects, but I'm not sure that it's a resolution change, it's a policy change.
Yeah, but I think also staff's recommending that we incorporate it in 26 fee schedule coming up, if that's okay. So that'll mean it'll be effective July 1 of 2025. We'll just incorporate it as a part of the fee setting
Okay.
schedule.
And we'd probably want to do some outreach to East Palo Alto, both their city leadership, but then I forget, well, this is for adults. Not for youth. We have what is the name of the organization that Bob Hoover runs? First Tee? Is that First Tee? Or is that no, First Tee is the youth program, period.
Yeah.
Bob Hoover's is the East Palo Alto one. Sorry, I'll see if I can find it.
Why
Anyway.
would we want to wait on this for $6,000 to $18,000? Sorry, $8,000 to $16,000.
Staff, as noted by Kylie, is recommending that we go through the Parks and Recs and along with the public outreach, and then along that path, we would bring it in as a part of the municipal fee update. If you want it to
Okay.
be more urgent, we
Well,
can.
they're gonna miss next year's golf.
Oh,
To wait till 26.
We
Yeah,
can talk
it's,
with.
yeah, I think we could definitely take this feedback to the community services director.
Sure.
Appreciate the fact that, the 16,000 is not too much of a concern and you're allowing us the flexibility for some expediency. So.
And it's, he heads both and we gave a proclamation for his long community service. But he heads the East Palo Alto Junior Golf and with Live in Peace.
I will share what I did learn when I came here was previously the city would take fee updates throughout the year, and it became a little bit cumbersome to do it that way. And we aggregated into an annual fee process when we come to council in April or so to update the fees. And I just want to caution that we don't want to go back maybe during the year and update the municipal fee.
Okay.
But noted.
And, I think this is something that they, East Palo Alto was not necessarily expecting. And so I don't think there's a sense of urgency from their standpoint, but
It could even be better to get publicity from the PRC, when they talk about it at that night. And
Yeah.
so that'll be fine.
Good.
My only other question was a different one. I don't understand what it says on the Office of Transportation status and process of the parking permits. I just didn't understand the last sentence. Evaluating general fund financial support.
Let me get to that one, make sure I'm reading the same one. We're talking about the $2 million, right? So.
There's no number there. It's only the
yes.
second one on the last page.
Yes, so we're referring to the parking permit pricing and parking permit fund financial status. And so the last sentence says, as a part of the fiscal 26 budget process, staff will be recommending evaluating the general fund financial support as a full or partial subsidy without obligation for repayment. That sentence?
Yes.
Okay. So as you may recall, in fiscal 25's budget, the general fund supported the various parking programs in the tune of $2 million. It is not apparent right now to what extent any of those funds can repay the general fund. So I think in this upcoming budget development process, it'll allow time for the Office of Transportation to implement some of the programs and studies, and that'll guide to what extent it's realistic that the general fund should anticipate any repayment or the council may decide what level of financial subsidy at that point, because the general fund is not going to be repaid.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay. I think that concludes our meeting tonight.
It does. Your next meeting is December 3rd, and that agenda will go out this week.
Merle.
Remind us the topics.
Oh, yes, it will be at 1:30 as well, just a note. It will include the annual comprehensive financial report, commonly known as the audited financial statements for June 30th of 2024. It'll also include the long-range financial forecast, an informational report for Q1's financial update, and also what's unique to this year's process is you will get a preliminary preview of the utility rate increases that staff is iterating. And so that'll come to you as well.
Great. All right, thank you.
Thank you.